safe and clear. This is a simple step that should be followed before working on any AEG or other airsoft gun. Before disassembling any AEG, be sure to remove the magazine, clear or fire the gun in the safe direction. Firing in semi-automatic once or twice should ensure that there are no BBs left inside the AEG. Set the safety to safe before removing the battery. Welcome to mechbox.com's video upgrade series. This video will demonstrate how to disassemble and upgrade the Tokyo Marui version 3 mechbox. We recommend the following basic tools for this disassembly: Phillips and slotted screwdrivers, both large and small, a set of metric Allen wrenches or hex head wrenches, a Torx driver size T10, needle nose and regular or channel lock pliers. For the upgrade, we recommend the following supplies and parts: silicone lubricant, gear grease, thread lock, an upgraded spring, a set of gear shims, and metal bushings. There are 3 varieties of the version 3 mechbox made by Tokyo Marui. The basic internal components such as the gears, the pistons, and springs are very much the same for each model. For this video, I will be disassembling the AK-47 version as shown here. The AUG version has a completely different trigger system and unique parts attached to the exterior, as you can see here. G36 models also have a version 3 mechbox with slightly different components. Let's get started with the AK-47 mechbox. I either forgot or did not properly release the tension on the main spring. See how the piston is partially retracted inside the cylinder. Now would be a good time to release that pressure by firing the mechbox once or twice. With the piston reset and the battery removed, start by removing the 2 screws holding the motor mount. Once the screws have been removed, remove the motor from the mechbox. There's no need to remove the electrical wiring, just set the motor clear of the mechbox. Next, remove the single Phillips screw from the fire selector half gear. This part controls the position of the tappet plate in relation to the fire selector switch. Once the screw is out, remove the half gears on both sides of the mechbox as shown here. Do your best to remember how these aligned with each other and with the teeth on the tappet plate. Placing items on the table in an orderly fashion can save lots of headaches when it comes time to reassemble everything. Using a flathead screwdriver, pry off the cover plate or retaining strap at the top of the mechbox as shown here. Once the plate is free, slide it off with your hands or a set of needle nose pliers. Using the Torx T10 bit driver, remove the 4 screws from the mechbox. Here you can see the location of those screws already removed. Next, remove the small plastic part just behind the trigger. Now open the mechbox case using a small flathead screwdriver, or just use your hands to pry it apart. In some cases, the mechbox can be difficult to open. However, they are just as likely to pop open unexpectedly, so be careful. One way to reduce the chance of flying parts is to insert a small screwdriver inside the back of the spring guide as shown here. Keep working the case open while maintaining sufficient down pressure on the screwdriver to maintain control over the main spring. While holding as many parts in place as possible, release the spring tension and start the process of removing the internal components. Begin by removing the spring guide, main spring and piston from the mechbox. On stock Tokyo Marui AEGs, the spring will remain attached to the piston. If the AEG has already been upgraded or modified, the parts may come out separately. Next, remove the small spring attached to the tappet plate as shown here. With the spring released, carefully take out the cylinder head, tappet plate, and air nozzle. Now focus your attention on the gears inside the mechbox. Hopefully when you open the case your gears didn't go flying. Either way, here's how the gears should look when properly installed. I'll highlight the parts shown here just for reference. First, here's the anti-reversal latch or reversal stop latch. This latch is designed to keep the gears from totally unwinding after every shot. There's a lot more science to the anti-reversal latch, but for now, just remember what this part looks like. The first gear to be removed is the bevel gear. This gear connects with the motor and spur gear. bevel gears rarely break, but can wear prematurely if the motor was poorly adjusted or misaligned. Second is the sector gear. The sector gear is what ultimately applies the power to the piston. This gear is the most likely gear to have problems over time. Stripped teeth on the half gear, missing or torn teeth on the gear connecting with the spur gear are just a few things to look for. The last gear out of the mech box is the spur gear. This intermediate gear acts as the transmission between the bevel gear and the sector gear. The spur gear can lose teeth on occasion, so it's worth looking it over before putting it back in the mech box. As you remove the gears from the mech box case, take your time and pay attention to the shims, bushings, and alignment of the gears. Getting familiar with the layout will save you lots of frustration when you're ready to put it back together. Start by removing the bevel gear. Next, remove the anti-reversal latch. Pay close attention to the orientation of the small spring attached to the latch. Without that small spring, the latch will not function properly and can lead to severe internal damage to the inside of your mech box. Take out the sector gear, again paying close attention to the shims and bushings. Now, remove the spur gear. After removing the gears and anti-reversal latch, take a few minutes to remove any loose parts inside the mech box, such as shims as shown here. In this video, I have already upgraded the bushings from the stock white nylon bushings to garter metal bushings. I highly recommend you replace nylon bushings with a good quality set of metal bushings. Here's how to remove the bushings from the mech box. Be careful if using a screwdriver. Don't pry too hard or you could dent or damage the bushing while trying to remove it. Now's a good time to clean the inside of the mech box. Remove any metal shavings, grease, or dirt using a towel, rag, or other cleaning tools you may have. The first step in putting it all back together is to install the bushings. I'm using needle nose pliers here so you can see the bushing. But I recommend using your fingers to insert the bushings as shown here. Once the bushing is in position, use the back of a screwdriver or some other non-metallic device to press the bushing into place. Many times the bushing will make a snap sound as it seats completely into the case. Just make sure the bushing is seated in the mech box correctly. It should be flat and almost flush with the case itself. Once you have all the bushings in place, I prefer to apply a little gear grease to the bushings before placing the shims and gears. The grease may be messy, but it definitely helps keep the shims in place. The art of shimming the gears does take a little practice. The important thing is to take your time and test as you go. Using diagrams that came with your new gear set, or maybe just using one shim under each gear is a good place to start. One good way to test the shimming and overall alignment of the gears is to install them in the mech box, putting the case back together and testing the movement of the gears by hand. Test to see if the gears are binding or appear to be too loose. Always keep in mind the relationship between each gear. If you shim one gear higher to take out slack, it may end up too close to another gear and cause binding. Whatever you do, don't overshim the gears to the point where they are difficult to move by hand. Making the gears too loose can be just as bad, so take your time. It's worth it. Once you've tested and retested the shimming of your gears, the next step is to set the timing of gears and start the rest of the reassembly. Do your best to keep your shims in place and reinstall the gears starting with the spur gear. After the spur gear is in place, put the anti-reversal latch in place and confirm that the spring is working as shown here. While holding the anti-reversal latch back, insert the bevel gear. Spin the bevel gear back until it locks into place with the anti-reversal latch as shown here. Now install the sector gear. Try not to move the other gears or the anti-reversal latch when placing the last gear in. The next objective is to align the sector gear using the tappet plate notch on the gear as a reference point. Lifting up and rotating the sector gear as needed, align the notch to a 1 o'clock position relative to the center of the gear as shown in this video. Once the gear is aligned, you can put the case together again and test to see that everything is still properly shimmed and moving freely. Now that everything is timed, aligned, and tested, carefully open the case again and confirm that the timing is still correct. If you haven't already, be sure to lube everything, including the gears and the piston rails inside the mech box. You can also add a light coating of silicone to the inside of the cylinder at this time. Next, carefully put in the reassembled cylinder, air nozzle, and the tappet plate. Roll the tappet plate and cylinder into place as shown here. Using needle nose pliers, be sure to reattach the tappet plate spring. If you remove the stock Tokyo Marui spring and want to replace it with an upgraded spring, you'll first need to remove the spring from the piston. Some guides have suggested cutting the head of the piston to locate the screw underneath. We've been using a different technique for a while. Let me show you. Start by wrapping a towel or rag around the piston head. You'll need just enough cloth to protect the piston head, but not so thick that you're unable to feel what you're doing. Very carefully turn the piston head counterclockwise using a pair of regular pliers or channel lock pliers. The head should come off without too much of a fight. If it does resist, be careful not to squeeze too hard trying to remove it, or you may bend, break, or otherwise ruin the piston head. With the piston head loose, remove it from the piston and pull the spring out. A small metal part will follow the spring. This is what the piston head was attached to. When replacing the original spring with an upgraded spring, simply reinsert the metal part back in the piston, apply a small amount of thread lock to the screw on the piston head, and tighten using the cloth and pliers technique as shown before. Again, be careful not to over-tighten or damage the piston head while tightening. Now that the piston is reassembled, add a little silicone gel to the rubber ring on the piston head. Insert the new spring and the spring guide into the piston. Then work the piston, spring, and spring guide into the cylinder. Now with one hand, hold the cylinder and tappet plate in position. Then, with your other hand, carefully compress the spring and spring guide into the piston. Use caution when compressing the spring. It's not uncommon for your hand to slip, causing the spring guide to shoot across the room. If something does explode at this stage, always double check your gear timing before continuing the spring install. With everything installed and properly timed, now install the other half of the mech box case. Using your fingers, try to hold the cylinder down and carefully maneuver the case into position. Align the bushings with the gears and so on. Sometimes the anti-reversal latch or trigger will interfere with getting everything aligned. Just keep trying. It should eventually come together just like it did when you were testing the shimming of the gears. On the AK-47 and the G36 mech box, don't forget to install the small metal part at the top of the mech box as shown here. Once the mech box is back together, slide the retaining strap or top plate back into position. This will help keep the mech box halves together while you're putting the screws in. Apply a small amount of thread lock on each screw before tightening. With the 4 main screws tightened, reinstall the small plastic part behind the trigger. Again, use a small amount of thread lock on the motor mount. Install and tighten those 2 screws. Now that the mech box is completely reassembled, you could test your upgrade before reinstalling it in the body. If you have the correct battery size available, just plug it in and test fire once or twice to see that everything is working smoothly. That's all there is to it. If you have questions or would like more details on how to get into your version 3 mech box, leave comments or send suggestions via our website.